Coming up.
You can see it highlighted there. 347 out of 348 when it comes to port efficiency. So the witnesses here at the end of the table, is that concerning in terms of Canada's potential when we are ranked so low when it comes to efficiencies of such a critical part of Canada's transportation infrastructure?
I'm not a trade person and I'm not a farmer. I eat food, so I care about what you do, but I really am going to ask some questions that may sound dumb.
Let me ask you this. How is there a definition in the Indo-Pacific strategy of what the government terms as quote-unquote clean energy?
So we add it all up. We have free trade agreements now with over 50% of the global economy. And yet, it doesn't seem like we're taking advantage of those newly negotiated and implemented agreements.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
I think it's self-evident that Canada needs trade and that we should be, and I would suggest can be, the supplier of choice. And in particular, I look at the three gentlemen here when it comes to our agricultural sector. And yet it seems to be that when it comes to our place, we don't seem to be growing as fast as certainly we could be. And I would suggest, and I would ask the question, the reason why I ask this question is because it's important when this committee compiles a report. So my question to the three gentlemen here at the end of the table is the method to which we transport our goods primarily to Asia would be what? If I could just go down the table, starting with Mr. Harvey, then Mr. Carey, and then Mr. Hines.
I mean, after leaving Canada by ship?
Mr. Carey?
Rail to port.
Mr. Hines.
And for soybeans, we're transporting in containers as well as transporting in bulk. We use a lot of containers, approximately 40,000 every year to export our soybeans.
And those would primarily go through?
Port of Montreal, Port of Halifax, Port of Prince Rupert, and Port of Vancouver.
Okay. So when it comes to specifically the Indo-Pacific, we have one major port, and although I know that there's a lot of conversations that, in fact, that I've had with some of your organizations about expanding that, but I'm looking at a copy the World Bank had S&P do a report on port efficiencies. And I know my Liberal colleagues like to talk about S&P a lot, so I hope they'll note this in particular. And in the context of this report, the Port of Vancouver ranks, you can see it highlighted there, 347 out of 348 when it comes to port efficiency. So the witnesses here at the end of the table, is that concerning in terms of Canada's potential when we are ranked so low when it comes to efficiencies of such a critical part of Canada's transportation infrastructure, which is essential to making sure that your members, those involved with your organizations, and the many producers that you all represent are able to get their products to market? We'll start with Mr. Harvey, and we'll keep it fairly short.
But working more on ports on a daily basis than me.
Okay, Mr. Carey.
Absolutely. I think Canada needs to get back in the business of nation building. We see if capacity is needed in the United States at Long Beach, they move heaven and earth regardless of party in power at the time. 7 out of 10 tons of grains grown in the prairies by farmers and many of your constituents, it goes through the Port of Vancouver still. We have one bridge that gets in the Port of Vancouver. We have one tunnel. And I know discussions with the city of Burnaby are 5 years now into improving some of the basic grade issues around railway passing. So it is a concern that is our gateway to the economic prosperity in Asia.
And I appreciate that. And move heaven and earth, I think, is a key phrase there, because you're absolutely right. We need to be a country that builds and actually gets things done. And it's regrettable that over the last 9 years or so that has not been the case. And just a shout out to my father, who's actually on the tractor right now. He said he's got a little over 1,000 acres of canola left to seed before we moved oats. So, Mr. Hines, you wanted to answer that.
Yes, thank you. So we export our soybeans in containers in bulk shipments. And to build on what my colleague said, predictability and reliability and cost competitiveness for Canadian shippers is paramount to our competitiveness. So in the soybean industry, we compete head-to-head with our American counterparts. And so when they have better service, when they have better rates, all of which comes from infrastructure as well as thinking about competition of the three global alliances that control the container market, for example, these are actions taken by government that have real impact on the shippers and our competitiveness that allows us to bring value here to Canada.
So when it comes to competitiveness, I'm glad you brought that up, because Canada, of course, pays a carbon tax, and while so that has an in particular and disproportionate effect on the transportation sector, specifically rail, which you all mentioned that it's important for commodities to get from the farm, which is generally by truck, to a inland port, which would then go on rail to a major port, and then from the port to wherever in the world. The carbon tax. Does that have an impact on Canada's competitiveness to be able to get our products to market? I'll start with Mr. Irons, then Mr. Carey, and then Mr. Harvey. Go ahead.
I think Mr. Carey is best placed to speak to this.
Sure, Mr. Carey.
It does. My organization has been a proponent of Bill C-234 since its inception. That would alleviate the carbon pricing on a farm. However, every time the price of carbon goes up, whether that's rail, whether that's inputs, custom haul trucking, that all gets passed down to the farmer in many ways. So farmers are saying that their major for canola, we have 60% of the world trade is Canada, but Australia is our largest competitor. They're much closer to markets, and they do not have a carbon tax. So anything that takes money out of the farmers' pockets to reinvest in their operations does impact our ability to compete with places like the United States, Australia, and South America.
No, and I appreciate that, and I hope my Liberal colleagues are watching, because quite often they say, oh, well, because you get money back, therefore everything's a wash, but it's that impact that it has on competitiveness that is very significant, and 234 does address, at least in its original form, a key part of that, but you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that it's so much more than that in terms of the impact on the sector as a whole. Am I correct in that?
Yes, 234 is only for on-farm activities related to natural gas and propane use. However, all the costs that we all see as normal Canadians, as well as transportation costs.
Sorry to interrupt, just in my last 10 seconds, all of you, if you could quick answer, can Canada grow its place in the world when it comes to agricultural exports? Yes or no? Mr. Irons, Mr. Carey, and Mr. Harvey.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yes.
Thank you.
I eat food, so I care about what you do, but I really am going to ask some questions that may sound dumb. Mr. Carey, you mentioned drought last year. I know that there are droughts and periods that are up and down. Can you explain to me the impact of climate change and what is happening about climate change and how farmers are having to deal with this? And this could be in canola, it could be in soy, or more generally in agri-food. I am feeling it. I'm just wondering how farmers are dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, farmers at the forefront whenever there's significant changes. We had significant droughts in the prairies, particularly Saskatchewan last year, where our canola production was down to 18.3 million tons. If it wasn't for advances, as my colleague Brian alluded to earlier, in seed technology, some of those farmers would have been relying solely on crop insurance. But because of advances in research and development, increases in drought tolerance with crops like canola, soybeans, corn, etc., they were able to get off a decent-sized crop. For canola, it's moisture, nitrogen, and then not too much heat. So there's certainly going to be challenges. However, gene editing, now that the government has provided clarity on that pathway to commercialization, is a real opportunity for Canada to take back some of those global R&D dollars to invest in crops that need less water, can deal with greater heat, and can be grown in different soil zones.
I would just maybe echo Mr. Kurek, who was hoping Liberals were listening when he was talking about taxes, that the Conservatives are listening when we're talking about climate change. I think it's a really important point. Mr. Innes, do you have anything you want to add?
Just to say that when we look into the future for the soybean industry, it has to work for farmers. And so as the climate evolves, so too do the crops that make sense for farmers in the regions that we farm. We're growing soybeans in the most northern places that they grow anywhere on the planet. And we have many diverse growing regions. And so when we think about innovation that needs to respond to farmers' needs, it's creating the varieties that work in the specific regions where farmers grow and that are resilient to changes in weather and are ultimately profitable for farmers.
think that there is a role for parliamentarians too to build those relationships and to ensure that we have that those connections and those relationships with people in the Indo-Pacific strategy as we try to diversify Canada's economy. But unfortunately, at this point, there is one party in the House of Commons that is not allowing for parliamentary travel at the moment, and it is disappointing because I think there is that role there. I feel, Mr. Kucharski, I feel like you're being a little bit abandoned, but we're both online, so I'm going to ask the next question of you if I could. You spoke a lot about Canada being left out of the, as you call it, the multilaterals, that we're not at those tables. We know that in the Indo-Pacific strategy that there is a desire by Canada to join in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity that the United States has launched in 2022. Can you explain why, first of all, why you think we're not being included? I think you touched on it, but just a little bit more detail. And also, do you think it is worthwhile? And what is the value of being part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity?
Yeah, so if we want to talk about the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, although it's certainly not as valuable to Canada as, say, the CPTPP is, which is a full-blown trade agreement, it is important to be at the table where significant players in the region are sitting down talking to each other. And unfortunately, we are not at that table. So it's not just about trade, or it's not even just about investment. It's about relationship building in the region, and we have not been able to establish our bona fides, as it were, yet in the region because, quite frankly, we've had decades of neglect. We've underinvested in the region. We have not come to the table as we should with the commitment that is expected of us on defense and security. And so as a result, I believe that that has made some countries reticent about inviting Canada to the table, and they're not sure if we're a serious player. And so that was what I was touching on in my earlier comments. So I think, as we go forward and as we do follow through on the commitments we've made in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and hopefully strengthen the ones that, on our military security side as well, that will change. But I think that's the background.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you, Jeff Kucharski. It's been a while. And I don't mean to be incestuous by bringing our Macdonald-Laurier roots together around this table, but I'll take advantage of the opportunity nevertheless. You've written extensively about the Indo-Pacific region. You've obviously looked at the Indo-Pacific strategy in careful detail. Let me ask you this. How is there a definition in the Indo-Pacific strategy of what the government terms as quote-unquote clean energy?
No, there isn't. It's a very general term, and it's defined, I guess, as they see it internally. So I couldn't tell you what clean energy is completely. Certainly there are things that most of us would consider as clean energy, non-emitting types of energy, but, people will differ on a definition of clean energy.
I appreciate that. We've seen, Professor Kucharski, that Europe has had a chance to redefine how it considers clean energy in the wake of Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine, particularly on things like LNG and nuclear. Would you agree, you've written extensively on Europe as well, but would you agree that that should be an international standard for, or at least the beginning of an international standard for defining what clean energy is?
Well, I do agree that if we're going to use a term like clean energy, it needs to be more specifically defined. And I think it should be more inclusive of even hydrocarbons where they are produced responsibly, where measures are taken to reduce emissions, because we're going to have to rely on all forms of energy in order to reach our emissions goals over time. So, yes, I would agree.
Well, thank you for that. You cautioned a little bit about what the impact of tension in the South China Sea could be, or even more widely in the waters of the Indo-Pacific region. Hong Kong Watch had recently published a report indicating that war with Taiwan would result in an 8% GDP hit to Canada, which is bigger than the COVID-19 pandemic, bigger than the global financial crisis. That would be 1% financial shocks, 5% semiconductor imports, 2% trade shocks. It strikes me that providing stability to the Indo-Pacific region, where you have energy suppliers like Russia leveraging their energy, or China's control and dominance of energy transition technologies, critical minerals refinery, all that stuff, Canada could play a critical role in offsetting dependence on dictator energy. How important do you think our energy proposition means to the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore ought to be read into the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, it's absolutely essential in my view, and I don't think the region. I think the region will be significantly held back if Canadian energy exports are in any way inhibited to the region. The fact remains that natural gas, in particular LNG, is going to be required in the region to reduce the amount of coal being burned and therefore to reduce emissions. So, LNG as a substitute for coal is very important in their transition policies. A lot of these countries, particularly in ASEAN, are developing countries, and they are not able, or there are geographic reasons why renewables can't be installed immediately. So we're talking about transition that will take place over decades. And so that's going to require a wide range of energy sources. And Canada is in a position to provide responsible energy supplies to these countries as they transition going forward. And so it's a benefit to Canada. It's a benefit to them. They're asking us for these products, and we're just on the cusp of supplying for the first time. But I think more needs to be done.
Our national security, I guess, really serves international energy security. And I'm very grateful for your many interventions over many years in pushing Canada to think big about what it can be.
What do you think a free trade agreement between Canada and the ASEAN would benefit Canada's soybean industry? And maybe if others have a thought on this, I would certainly like to hear you. And why?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, but I know my colleagues would also like to contribute. So when we look at trade agreements, they establish relations between governments. They establish a real opportunity to make trade more stable. And we really want to see a useful agreement established between Canada and Indonesia and ASEAN.
I would just quickly say that we're very supportive of the Canada-ASEAN as well as the Canada-Indonesia Free Trade Agreement. We cannot take international trade for granted. For those of us that were at the WTO Ministerial Conference in the UAE this year, rules-based international trade is something that directly benefits every Canadian, regardless of your sector, and it's not something we can take for granted. So the more multilaterals, bilaterals Canada signs, more rules-based trade, the better the quality of living for all 40-odd million Canadians.
And I'd just add that these are quickly growing markets, and our competitors are there. Australia has an agreement with these countries.
Thank you.
very
And
much.
I know
That's your time, Ms.
Mr.
Lalonde.
Chair.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Kusartsis.
Oh, well, all right. Yes, we'll give Mr. Kacharski a quick moment here. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
Okay, I was just going to say very quickly, it's very gratifying to hear that the soybean and canola growers are looking to expand and diversify markets in ASEAN. I applaud that. The one thing I would say why that's particularly important is that before 2019, I just had a quick look at the statistics, but before the ban on canola, China represented 40% of Canada's total canola exports, and today, with $5 billion in exports, as was mentioned, Canada relies on the Chinese market for 65% of its total exports of canola. So as good as that business is, I just want to point out that's a huge vulnerability in a world where tensions with China are likely to continue, and there are very likely to be disagreements again between Canada and China at some point. You can bet that that number of canola exports will be used as a coercive mechanism by China again. It's a vulnerability we do have.
You know, when I first arrived here in 2004, a lot of free trade agricultural associations were telling us that we needed to diversify trade away from the United States because we were overly reliant on that single trading partner. And so subsequently, governments negotiated the Common Economic Trade Agreement with the European Union and the CPTPP in the Indo-Pacific region. When you look at global GDP, we've got a free trade agreement with the United States, which is about a quarter of global GDP. We've got one with Europe, which is just under 20%, and now we have one with the Indo-Pacific region, which is roughly another 15 or so percent. So we add it all up, we have free trade agreements now with over 50% of the global economy. And yet, it doesn't seem like we're taking advantage of those newly negotiated and implemented agreements. You know, I pulled up some trade data. In 2022, the most recent year for which I have data, Canada's primary and secondary agricultural production amounted to $94 billion Canadian. Some of that going to the Indo-Pacific region. The Netherlands exported 167 billion Canadian dollars on current exchange rates. That's almost double what we exported. So why are grains and oilseeds associations not? What's the solution to this? Right? What's the solution? Because you know the Dutch export more fats and oils than we do, and as you know, they're on a postage stamp of a country. How come they export way more fats and oils than we do?
If I could start, thank you for the question. I guess I would first share that we are taking advantage of opportunities created by trade agreements. I was just in Korea as part of the Team Canada Trade Mission, and we have 17,000 tons out of a 300,000 ton market that we fill routinely every year. That is tariff-free, that is opportunity for us to add value and have the highest value soybeans go to those customers who appreciate our quality, and we would love to have more of that 300,000 ton market than the 17 that we have now through the trade agreement. So I would say that there are opportunities and we are taking advantage of them. But to your question, how do we get more? I think that's a really important question that our industry is continually speaking to our government partners about federally and provincially. And for us, it's about recognizing our competitive and comparative advantage and looking at the infrastructure required to help us excel. So there was a question earlier about transportation infrastructure. That is a key piece of it. Innovation infrastructure and research infrastructure that allows the industry to capture the most value from the highest value markets, to your point around how the Netherlands succeeds. We see those as key opportunities. So for us, for example, we're working on the next generation of a soy quality program. How do we sell the highest quality soy in the world without having a soy quality program here in Canada is a key question we're struggling with that we need to work together in our country on.
I would just say it's a very good question. And besides what my colleague said, we need massive investments in our trade corridors, our infrastructure, our ports, the demurrage costs. But
so as a colleague might mentioned, the Port of Vancouver ranked 347th out of 348 ports for global efficiency, second last out of 348. So what do we need to do to get the Port of Vancouver more efficient so that we can export more of your members' products to the Indo-Pacific region? Because that is our country's largest port.
Yeah, if you look at it from a resilience perspective, I said earlier, we have one bridge and we have one tunnel that goes in the Port of Vancouver. That's all owned by CN. So we have no resilience. There's no backup plan for that. Marine vessel traffic still takes precedence over getting rails action in the Port of Vancouver. We need railways to deliver on time. They need to be predictable. But to your broader point around why the Netherlands are so successful is, I would suggest that not only signing a free trade agreement is just the start. Implementing and following through on trade agreements are critical. The USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, have an entire office dedicated to the enforcement of their free trade agreements. We have not seen the CETA agreement provide really the opportunities for agriculture because the EU is not following through on the spirit of that. So I think a big part of it is looking at signing a trade agreement is relatively easy. It's very difficult, relatively easy. Implementing and enforcing the spirit of free trade agreements is something Canada needs to make a priority.